Lucas stood at the entrance of the abandoned amusement park, his breath visible in the cold night air. The towering, rusted gates creaked in the wind, a haunting echo that seemed to welcome him into the decaying remnants of forgotten joy. Beyond the gates, the park lay in eerie silence, its once vibrant attractions now lifeless, swallowed by creeping vines and shadows. The smell of damp earth and rust hung heavy in the air, mixing with the faint scent of something old, something rotten. As he stepped through the gates, his heart pounded in his chest, a deep, instinctive warning that this place was wrong. The fog swirled around his feet, thickening with each step, as if the ground itself sought to trap him. His eyes were drawn to the massive silhouette of the roller coaster in the distance, its skeletal frame outlined against the night sky like the bones of some long-dead creature. Even from afar, Lucas could hear it, a faint, distant scream. He froze, straining to listen, but the sound quickly dissipated, leaving only the soft rustle of the wind. His rational mind fought to dismiss it as his imagination, but a gnawing unease clawed at him. The roller coaster had been abandoned for years. No one had ridden it in decades. So why did it feel like the screams had come from within? As he approached the coaster, the air grew colder, biting at his skin. The metal rails, once gleaming with the joy of laughter, were now tarnished, covered in a dark red patina that resembled dried blood under the pale moonlight. The carriages, motionless, sat on the tracks like tombstones, and yet Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him. He glanced around, expecting to see someone, anyone, lurking in the shadows. But he was alone, or so he thought. Suddenly, a soft, metallic clink echoed from the direction of the coaster. His heart skipped a beat as he spun around, eyes darting to the source. One of the carriages had shifted ever so slightly, as if nudged by an invisible hand. It was impossible. The roller coaster had been dead for years. Yet, as he watched in growing horror, another metallic creak broke the silence. The carriage trembled, and a long, low groan rumbled through the structure. The sound was unmistakable now. The grind of gears long disused, the subtle clatter of chains pulling tight. Lucas swallowed hard, his throat dry. The coaster was coming to life. The faint cries grew louder, more distinct, and they no longer sounded distant. They were here, all around him, overlapping in a cacophony of terror. Children's voices, full of fear, pleading and screaming, mixed with the panicked yells of adults. Lucas backed away, but his feet felt like lead. Something was keeping him here, some invisible force drawing him closer to the cold, rusted metal. His mind raced, but the screams drowned out all thought, filling his ears, his mind, his soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Silence fell like a heavy curtain, oppressive and suffocating. The fog seemed to close in on him, thickening, twisting, almost alive. His breath came in shallow gasps as he glanced back at the roller coaster. The carriages were still once more, frozen in their rusted glory. But Lucas knew he wasn't alone. This park was not just abandoned. It was haunted by something far worse than time or neglect. Something ancient, malevolent, and very much awake. Lucas continued through the desolate amusement park, the memories stirring at the edges of his mind, flickering like faint shadows. As he moved deeper into the park, something strange tugged at him, an unsettling familiarity, as if he had walked these paths before. His steps grew hesitant as he approached a weathered ticket booth. The glass was shattered, the wood rotting, but something inside caught his eye. Beneath a pile of old, discarded tickets lay one that seemed pristine, untouched by the decay of time. His heart raced as he reached out, picking it up. The ticket was faded, but as he ran his fingers over the paper, a cold chill surged through him. He stared at the name printed on it in smeared ink, his name. A sudden jolt of recognition struck him like a punch to the gut. He had been here before, not just recently, but long ago, when the park was still alive with lights and laughter. A buried memory surfaced, one he had suppressed for years. A day spent here as a child, holding tightly to his parents' hands as they wandered through the park. He stumbled back, clutching the ticket as fragmented memories flooded his mind. That day had been his birthday, a celebration that had ended in chaos and terror. He remembered the sound of sirens, the panic screams, the park's sudden shutdown after a catastrophic accident. But the details were fuzzy, like a dream fading upon waking. Yet, one thing remained crystal clear. The roller coaster had been involved. The same coaster he now stood before, broken and dead, but still carrying the weight of that day's tragedy. As Lucas tried to piece together the fragments of his past, a sharp pain seared through his arm. He looked down to see an old scar on his wrist, one he had long forgotten. The scar had always been there, but he never remembered how he got it. Now, the answer became horrifyingly clear. It was from the accident. He had been on the roller coaster that day. His breath quickened, heart hammering in his chest as the realization hit him. The accident hadn't just been a tragedy. It had involved him directly. His thoughts raced, trying to fill in the gaps. Why had he repressed these memories for so long? What had truly happened that day? As if answering his thoughts, a soft sound reached his ears, a familiar melody. The eerie notes of a lullaby drifted through the night air, faint but unmistakable. It was a song from his childhood, one his mother used to sing to him. The haunting tune echoed through the empty park, growing louder, closer. Lucas' blood ran cold. His mother hadn't been at the park that day, or had she? The lullaby seemed to wrap itself around him, pulling him deeper into the maze of memories and fear. Every note sent a shiver down his spine, as if the very air was infused with the sorrow and pain of that forgotten day. Lucas turned in circles, trying to locate the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His heart pounded in his ears, matching the rhythm of the haunting melody. Then, through the fog, he saw it, a figure standing near the roller coaster's entrance. It was hazy at first, but as the fog parted, he could see it more clearly. A woman, standing motionless. The figure was familiar, painfully so. His breath caught in his throat as the figure turned slowly toward him. It was his mother, or, at least, something that looked like her. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, as if drained of life. She didn't speak, but the lullaby continued, as if playing from some unseen source. The figure stared at him, unblinking, as the melody filled the air, wrapping around him like a cold, suffocating blanket. Lucas wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. His feet were rooted to the spot as the figure of his mother began to walk toward him, her movements slow, unnatural, almost as if she were floating. The lullaby grew louder, deafening, drowning out all thought. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "You left me here." Terror gripped him, twisting his insides as her words echoed in his mind. He couldn't understand. He hadn't left anyone, or had he? Memories twisted and blurred. He had survived that day, but at what cost? What had really happened? As she moved closer, the shadows around her deepened, and Lucas knew in his heart that this was not his mother. This was something else, something far older and far more malevolent, using his past against him. The figure stopped just inches from him, her hollow eyes boring into his soul. The lullaby abruptly stopped, leaving the park in a suffocating silence. Then, she whispered again, her voice like ice. "Come back, finish what you started." Lucas' mind spiraled as the realization dawned. Whatever had happened that day wasn't over. The park, the roller coaster, the accident. It was all connected to him, to a dark truth he had buried. And now, the past had come back, demanding answers. Lucas stood frozen, his heart racing as the figure of his mother faded into the thick fog, leaving him alone in the crushing silence of the abandoned park. His mind was spinning, struggling to make sense of the twisted memories and the haunting presence that had just confronted him. The air around him seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, as though the park itself was alive, watching his every move, waiting for him to make the next step. As Lucas tried to collect himself, a sudden jolt of pain shot through his wrist. The old scar that had begun to throb earlier now burned with an intensity that brought him to his knees. He clutched his wrist, gasping in pain as visions flooded his mind. Fragments of that day, the day of the accident, but not as he remembered it. He saw the roller coaster, heard the screams, felt the terror. But this time, there was something more. His reflection in a shattered mirror, the same scarred wrist, but his childlike hand gripping a small, familiar object, a toy he had loved as a child. The memory felt vivid, more real than before, and as he blinked, the toy appeared before him, lying in the dirt, half buried beneath the decaying leaves. He hesitated for a moment, his mind screaming to leave it, but something deeper compelled him to reach out. His hand trembled as he picked up a small, worn-out wooden car, the same toy he had carried that day so long ago. But now, it felt different, cold, heavy, wrong. As his fingers wrapped around the toy, the air seemed to shift, growing colder, denser. From behind him, the eerie, metallic clink of the roller coaster echoed once more. The ground beneath his feet trembled as the coaster's rusted chains groaned to life, dragging the carriages up the track, though the park remained empty. He could feel it now, the malevolent presence that had been lurking, watching him, waiting for him to remember. Suddenly, the world around him seemed to warp, and Lucas found himself no longer in the abandoned park, but in a dark, distorted version of it. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, twisting into grotesque forms, and the air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. Before him stood the roller coaster, towering and monstrous, its once familiar frame now draped in darkness. At the base of the ride, two ghostly figures materialized, their forms flickering in and out of existence like static on a broken television. One was a faint outline of his mother, the other a small, shadowy version of his younger self, gripping the same toy car that now burned in his hand. A voice, low and filled with malice, slithered into his mind, cold as ice. "Choose." Lucas stumbled back, panic flooding his chest. He didn't understand. Choose what? His mind raced as the figures moved closer, their hollow eyes locked on him. The voice spoke again, louder this time, rattling his bones. "You must choose, to save them, or to save yourself." In an instant, the impossible choice became clear. The park, the accident, the deaths, none of it had been a coincidence. Lucas had been part of something far darker. The entity that haunted this place wasn't just a vengeful spirit. It was a force that fed on fear, on guilt, on pain. And now, it was offering him a choice, one that would either condemn him or free him, though at a terrible cost. The figures before him shifted, flickering in the shadows. His mother, her face pale and sorrowful, stared at him with hollow, pleading eyes. His younger self, innocent and terrified, stood silently, holding out the toy car as if offering it back to him. The weight of the decision pressed down on Lucas like a crushing weight. He had to choose between two paths, neither of them offering salvation without sacrifice. The first choice was agonizing. He could offer up his most precious childhood memory, his mother's love, her lullabies, the joy of their moments together. In doing so, he would save her soul from being trapped in this cursed place, but he would lose her forever, both in life and in memory. He would no longer remember her face, her voice, or the warmth of her embrace. It would all be gone, as if she had never existed. The second choice was far darker. Lucas could absorb part of the entity's darkness, taking the curse into himself to bind it and prevent it from taking more lives. But this choice would come at a terrible price, his sanity. The entity would become a part of him, whispering in his thoughts, feeding on his fears, and slowly eroding his mind until he could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. He would live, but he would never truly be free. His hands trembled as he stood before the two figures, their forms blurring in his tear-filled vision. The roller coaster loomed behind them, its chains rattling, as if urging him to decide. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to run, to escape, but the park had him in its grasp. There was no running from this. As Lucas stood on the precipice of this impossible choice, the voice of the entity, deep and cruel, echoed once more. Choose, or they all suffer. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized that either way, he would lose something vital, either his mother or his sanity. There was no turning back now, only the agonizing decision that would seal his fate and determine whether he would leave this cursed place as himself, or something far worse. The fog around Lucas thickened, wrapping itself around him like a cold, suffocating shroud. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he stood frozen, the weight of his impossible choice still hanging over him like a dark cloud. The air felt heavy, dense with the presence of something unseen but undeniably there. The park, once silent and still, now seemed to hum with a sinister energy, as if it had woken from a long, restless slumber. The shadows, once mere extensions of the night, began to shift and move, taking on forms that made his blood run cold. A faint whisper echoed through the park, soft at first, like the rustling of dead leaves in the wind. But as Lucas strained to listen, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were voices, low, guttural, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The sound came from all around him, as if the very shadows were alive, murmuring in the darkness. He spun in place, eyes darting from one corner of the park to another, but there was nothing to see. Only the shifting, writhing shadows, and those terrible whispers. The voices grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of terror, and Lucas could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him. Were they real? Or was it the entity, playing with his mind, feeding on his fear? The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, and for a moment, it felt as though the very earth was alive, pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. As the whispers surrounded him, Lucas became acutely aware that he was no longer alone. The shadows around him were no longer just tricks of the light. They moved with purpose, twisting and coiling like snakes, creeping closer with each passing second. He could feel their cold breath on his skin, hear their hushed, mocking laughter as they circled him. Panic surged through him, but his feet refused to move, rooted to the ground by some unseen force. The world around him felt wrong, distorted, as if reality itself was unraveling. From the corner of his eye, Lucas saw something flicker in the distance. A figure, half hidden in the fog, standing near the roller coaster. It was just a silhouette at first, a vague outline in the mist, but as he stared, the figure became clearer. His breath caught in his throat. It was the same figure from before, the apparition of his mother, standing motionless, her face obscured by the shadows. But something was different now. The figure wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the swirling fog, more figures began to appear. Dozens of them, faint, ghostly forms, flickering in and out of sight, their faces twisted in expressions of pain and fear. Their eyes were dark, hollow, and lifeless, like empty sockets staring into his soul. Lucas stumbled back, heart pounding in his chest as the figures moved closer, their whispers growing louder, filling his mind with a chorus of despair. The words were incomprehensible, but the intent was clear. They wanted him. The roller coaster groaned, its rusted chains rattling like the last breaths of a dying beast. The carriages, still unmoving, seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, their metal frames warped and twisted, as if time itself had bent around them. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the figures were all drawn to the coaster. They moved toward it slowly, methodically, their eyes never leaving him, as if beckoning him to follow. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, filling his ears with a relentless, maddening drone. One word stood out among the whispers, repeated over and over, echoing in his mind like a sinister chant. Join, join, join. Lucas shook his head, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out of this cursed place, but his body remained frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. He could feel the presence of the entity now, closer than ever, its cold, invisible fingers wrapping around his throat, squeezing just enough to remind him that he was at its mercy. The shadows at his feet began to shift again, growing longer, darker. They twisted and writhed, forming grotesque shapes that slithered across the ground toward him. His breath quickened as he watched the shadows take on vaguely human forms, their faces contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. He backed away, his feet finally responding to the overwhelming terror, but the shadows followed, closing in around him like a pack of hungry predators. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the park, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far worse, the smell of death. The fog thickened, swirling violently around him, and the voices reached a deafening crescendo, each one demanding his submission, his surrender to the darkness. "Join us," they whispered over and over, their words dripping with malice. "Join us and be free." Lucas clutched his head, trying to block out the voices, but they were inside his mind now, gnawing at his sanity, pushing him closer to the edge of madness. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he saw himself, trapped in the darkness, his body twisted and broken, his soul consumed by the same entity that had taken the others. But then, in the midst of the chaos, another sound broke through, the faint, familiar tune of the lullaby. It was distant, barely audible beneath the roar of the whispers, but it was enough. It grounded him, pulled him back from the brink. The lullaby was his mother's voice, gentle and soothing, cutting through the darkness like a beacon of light. With a surge of desperation, Lucas broke free of the shadow's grip and ran. His feet pounded against the ground, carrying him away from the figures, away from the whispers, away from the nightmare. But as he fled, the realization hit him. No matter how far he ran, no matter how fast the park, the shadows, the entity, they would never let him go. Lucas ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the fog swallowed the path before him. His legs burned, but no matter how fast he moved, the suffocating feeling of dread clung to him like a second skin. The voices had quieted, but the silence that replaced them was worse, unnatural, oppressive, and filled with the weight of anticipation. Every step he took echoed through the empty amusement park, each sound amplified in the stillness. It felt as though the very ground beneath him was watching, waiting for him to falter. As he stumbled into an open clearing near the center of the park, Lucas came to a halt, chest heaving. Before him stood the rusted Ferris wheel, looming in the distance like a silent sentinel. Its cabin swayed slightly in the wind, though the mechanism was long dead. The sight of it was unnerving, but what truly caught his attention was the faint reflection in a nearby puddle, a reflection that shouldn't have been there. Lucas froze, staring down into the dark water. The reflection showed not only him, but behind him a figure, tall, gaunt, and distorted, its features twisted in ways that defied comprehension. Its eyes were hollow pits, and from its open mouth came no sound, only a black void that seemed to suck in the very light around it. He spun around in terror, but there was no one there. The space behind him was empty, yet the reflection remained, standing still in the water, watching him. His heart pounded as cold sweat trickled down the back of his neck. Was it the entity playing tricks on his mind? Was this some new form of torment? Lucas couldn't be sure, but the reflection seemed real, more real than anything else in the park. Slowly, as if drawn by an unseen force, he knelt beside the puddle, staring into the distorted image of himself and the grotesque figure behind him. And then it spoke, not with words but with sensation, a deep, visceral feeling of fear. It washed over him in waves, seeping into his bones, clouding his mind. It wasn't just any fear. It was his fear, raw and unfiltered. The terror of being alone, of being trapped, of losing control. The reflection twisted further, the figure behind him growing more defined, more human in its horror. Its face was no longer a vague monstrosity. It was his face, twisted and contorted in agony, as if it were a dark mirror showing what he could become. Lucas's hands shook as he tried to pull away, but he couldn't. The reflection had him ensnared, showing him his deepest, most personal fears. The image flickered, and suddenly, he was a child again, standing in front of the roller coaster on that fateful day. He could hear the screams, smell the scent of burning rubber and metal, feel the helplessness of being caught in something much larger than himself. The memory morphed into something darker. He saw himself climbing into the roller coaster, but this time it wasn't just an innocent ride. He was being pulled in by the entity, dragged toward an abyss that had no bottom. The reflection whispered, "You cannot escape your fear." His breathing quickened. The park wasn't just haunted by the past, it was feeding on him. It was using his own fears against him, drawing them out, amplifying them until he could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. The entity, whatever it was, thrived on fear, and now it had found his deepest vulnerability. Lucas struggled to stand, to tear himself away from the puddle and its nightmarish reflection. His head pounded with the force of his terror, and for a moment, he was convinced he would never break free. But then, from somewhere deep within the fog, a new sound emerged, faint but unmistakable. A child's laugh. It echoed through the park, light and innocent, a cruel juxtaposition to the horror that had consumed him. The laugh grew louder, closer, and as Lucas turned toward the source, he saw it, his younger self, standing in the distance, holding the small wooden toy car from his childhood. The child stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes, but there was something wrong. His smile was too wide, his posture too stiff. And then, the boy's mouth opened, and the voice that came from it was not his own. "You know you belong here," the voice whispered, soft but insidious. "You've always belonged here." The ground beneath Lucas began to tremble, the shadows around him twisting and writhing as if they, too, were responding to the child's words. The reflection in the puddle continued to flicker, showing him visions of his future, of what he would become if he stayed. His mind spun in a whirlwind of fear, each image more horrifying than the last. He saw himself wandering the park forever, trapped, lost, consumed by the darkness that had claimed so many before him. He saw his own face twisted into the same monstrous expression as the figures in the fog, his eyes hollow, his soul devoured. Lucas clutched his head, trying to block out the visions, the voices, the terror that was slowly unraveling his sanity. But it was no use. The entity had him in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. "Let go of your fear," the child's voice urged. "Give in, and it will all be over." The temptation was overwhelming. To let go, to stop fighting, to give in to the fear and finally be free. It was so simple, so easy. But deep down, in the darkest corner of his mind, Lucas knew the truth. Giving in wouldn't free him. It would condemn him. The park, the entity, the shadows, they thrived on fear. And if he surrendered, he would become a part of it. Just another lost soul wandering the fog, forever trapped in a nightmare of his own making. With a surge of willpower, Lucas tore himself away from the reflection, stumbling back as the puddle rippled violently. The child's laugh echoed once more, fading into the distance as the fog thickened. But Lucas knew it wasn't over. The park wasn't done with him. The entity wasn't done with him. And as the shadows around him whispered and writhed, Lucas realized that his greatest battle was yet to come. The terror wasn't just in the park. It was inside him, and it was waiting for him to fall. Lucas stood in the heart of the abandoned amusement park, the fog swirling around him like a living thing, the whispers from the shadows growing louder, more insistent. His mind raced, trying to grasp the full horror of what was happening, but the fear was overwhelming. The entity, whatever it was, had been toying with him, feeding on his deepest fears, twisting reality around him. He knew now that it wasn't just the park that was haunted. It was him. The dark force had latched onto him, manipulating his memories, his emotions, and now it wanted something more. It wanted him. As Lucas tried to clear his mind, he felt a sharp, cold pain in his chest. It wasn't physical, but it was real. A deep, aching void, like something important had been ripped from him. He clutched his chest, gasping, and through the fog, he saw it. The roller coaster, looming in the distance, its rusted tracks gleaming under the pale moonlight. The screams were back, faint but growing louder, filling the air with a chorus of despair and pain. And at the foot of the roller coaster stood the figure of his mother, no longer just a ghostly apparition, but something far more tangible, far more terrifying. Her face was twisted in sorrow, her eyes dark and hollow, and she beckoned him forward with a slow, deliberate motion. Behind her, the figures from his past began to materialize. The child version of himself, the faceless passengers from the coaster, and others, all blurred and distorted, their forms flickering like dying candles in the dark. They were waiting for him, watching, and Lucas knew that whatever was coming next, there would be no turning back. As he moved toward the roller coaster, drawn by an unseen force, the air grew colder, thicker, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around him. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the fog parted just enough to reveal a grotesque sight. Corpses, half buried in the dirt, their twisted faces frozen in eternal screams. Some looked fresh, others were mere skeletons, but all were staring at him with hollow, accusing eyes. His stomach churned as the realization hit him. These were the victims of the park, those who had died in the accident, those whose souls had been consumed by the entity. And now, it was his turn. The roller coaster groaned to life, its chains rattling and screeching as the cars slowly began to move along the track, though no one was aboard. The metal clanged together in a violent, eerie symphony that reverberated through the empty park, and with each creak, Lucas felt the presence of the entity growing stronger. It was here, in the very air, in the ground beneath his feet, in the shadows that clung to every corner of his vision. He could feel it watching him, waiting for him to make his move. But what move? What choice did he have? The roller coaster loomed before him like a gateway to hell, and the whispers of the dead called to him from the shadows. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape this nightmare, but his body refused to obey. He was being pulled closer, drawn in by a force that he couldn't fight. Then, as if in answer to his unspoken question, the entity revealed itself. It wasn't just a shadow, or a voice, or a trick of the mind. It was real. A massive, shifting figure emerged from the fog, its form constantly changing, growing, contracting. It was made of darkness, pure, inky blackness that seemed to swallow the light around it. Its eyes were empty voids, but they burned with a malevolent intelligence. The whispers in Lucas's mind grew deafening as the entity towered over him, filling the space with its presence. "You were always meant to return," it whispered, its voice low and venomous, as if it were speaking directly into his soul. "You brought this upon yourself. This is your fate." The words sent a chill through Lucas's entire body. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his memories, trying to understand how he had come to this moment. The entity was right. He had come here before. As a child, he had been at the park on that fateful day. But it wasn't an accident. The park had been calling to him then, just as it was calling to him now. He had escaped before, but not without consequence. The entity had marked him, had claimed him, and now it was time for him to fulfill his role. Lucas stared up at the monstrous figure, his heart pounding in his chest. His entire life had led to this moment, and deep down, he knew what he had to do. There was no running from this. There was no escape. He had to face the entity, had to confront the darkness that had been following him for so long. But how? How could he fight something so ancient, so powerful, so completely beyond his understanding? The answer came to him in a flash, a memory, buried deep in his mind, of his mother singing to him when he was a child. It wasn't just a lullaby. It was a shield, a way to protect him from the nightmares that plagued him even then. She had known, somehow, that the entity would come for him, and she had given him the strength to fight it. The lullaby echoed in his mind now, soft and familiar, cutting through the fear, giving him clarity. Lucas took a deep breath, steeling himself. He couldn't fight the entity with brute force, but he could resist its control. He could reject the fear, the guilt, the pain that it had fed on for so long. He could break the cycle. "I won't give in," Lucas said, his voice trembling but resolute. "You won't take me," the entity hissed, its form shifting violently. But Lucas stood his ground. The shadows around him writhed, the voices of the dead screamed in his ears. But he focused on the lullaby, on the memory of his mother's voice, on the strength that came from love, not fear. Slowly, the entity began to weaken, its form losing shape, its whispers growing fainter. With a final surge of will, Lucas stepped forward, facing the roller coaster, facing the past, and stepped into the car that awaited him. The coaster jerked to life, the chains pulling him up the rusted track, but this time, he wasn't afraid. The entity's power over him was fading, and as he ascended the first hill, he felt a strange sense of peace. At the top, the park spread out below him, dark and silent, but he knew that this was the end. The entity was fading, its grip on him broken. The coaster plummeted down the track, and with it, the last remnants of the nightmare dissolved into the fog. For the first time in years, Lucas was free. But as the roller coaster slowed to a stop, a single whisper lingered in the air. "This is not the end." As the roller coaster slowed to a halt, Lucas sat in the rusted car, his breath heavy, the fog swirling thickly around him. He could feel the stillness in the air, a sense of quiet that felt wrong, too quiet. He had confronted the entity, broken its hold, but deep down, he knew it wasn't over. The silence was not a sign of peace. It was the calm before the storm. The park, the shadows, and the entity that lurked within were still waiting for him to make one final mistake. Stepping out of the roller coaster car, Lucas's legs felt weak, as though the ground beneath him was trembling with anticipation. His heart pounded as he looked around the park, searching for any sign of movement. But the fog had thickened, turning the once familiar structures into vague, hulking shapes in the mist. He was alone, but it didn't feel like it. He could feel something watching him from just beyond the veil of fog, something ancient and malevolent. The entity was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to falter. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound rumbled through the air, like the groan of something impossibly large waking from its slumber. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and Lucas spun around, eyes wide as he saw the roller coaster come to life once more. The chains rattled violently. The cars screeched along the tracks, but there was no one in them. The ride was moving on its own, its rusted, jagged metal groaning with each twist and turn. The sound was deafening, a mechanical roar that echoed through the empty park, filling the air with the weight of impending doom. Lucas took a step back, his pulse quickening as he realized what was happening. The entity was not just a ghost haunting the park. It was the park. The rides, the attractions, the very ground beneath his feet. It was all a part of the entity, a manifestation of the ancient darkness that had claimed this place. And now, it was fully awake, hungry, and intent on consuming him. From the shadows, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a faint shimmer in the mist, but as it moved closer, its form became clearer, tall, towering, and impossibly twisted. The entity had taken shape, its body a grotesque blend of rusted metal, shadows, and smoke, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the fog like burning coals. Its limbs were long and jagged, resembling the twisted metal of the roller coaster itself, and its presence was suffocating, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as the entity drew closer, its twisted form moving with an unnatural fluidity, like liquid shadow crawling across the earth. The air around him grew colder, the ground beneath his feet cracking and crumbling as the entity approached. He could feel its power, its hunger, pressing in on him, threatening to crush him under the weight of its malevolence. The whispers in his mind returned, louder and more insistent than ever, filling his head with a chorus of voices, pleading, accusing, mocking. "You can't escape," the entity hissed, its voice a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You are mine." Lucas stumbled back, his mind racing. How could he fight something so powerful, so all-encompassing? The entity wasn't just a spirit. It was a force, an ancient evil that had consumed countless souls before him. And now, it wanted him to join them. As the entity loomed over him, its massive, twisted form casting a shadow that swallowed everything in its path, Lucas realized the terrible truth. The entity wasn't just feeding on fear, it was feeding on him. His memories, his emotions, his very soul. It had been drawing him back to the park all along, luring him into its grasp, feeding on his guilt, his fear, his pain. Every step he had taken, every choice he had made, had been part of the entity's plan. But now, standing in the face of this overwhelming darkness, Lucas felt something stir inside him, a flicker of defiance, of strength. He had faced the entity's tricks, its illusions, its manipulations. He had confronted the darkest parts of himself, and though he was afraid, he wasn't broken. Not yet. The entity snarled, its glowing eyes narrowing as it sensed the shift in Lucas's resolve. It lashed out, its shadowy limbs reaching for him, trying to engulf him, to consume him. But Lucas stood his ground. He knew now that fear was the key. The entity fed on fear, thrived on it, but it could also be defeated by it. With a deep breath, Lucas reached into his jacket and pulled out the small wooden toy car, the relic of his childhood, the memory that had haunted him throughout this ordeal. The car felt cold and heavy in his hand, its surface worn and familiar. It was more than just a toy. It was a symbol of his past, of his connection to the park, of the guilt he had carried for so long. Holding the car tightly, Lucas stared up at the entity, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been running from his past, from his fear, for too long. But now, in this final moment, he understood. He couldn't destroy the entity, but he could reject it. He could refuse to give it the power it craved. "I'm not afraid of you," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling but firm. "Not anymore." The entity roared in fury, its twisted form writhing in the fog, the ground shaking beneath its rage. Its shadowy limbs reached for Lucas, but he held his ground, refusing to be consumed. The toy car in his hand began to glow faintly, a soft, warm light emanating from its surface. It wasn't just a memory. It was a reminder of who he was, of the love and innocence that the entity could never take from him. As the light grew stronger, the entity began to recoil, its form flickering and distorting. The shadows around Lucas started to dissolve, the fog lifting as the light from the toy car spread through the park, illuminating the darkness. The roller coaster groaned one last time before falling silent, its metal frame sagging as the entity's grip on the park weakened. The voices in Lucas's mind grew quieter, fainter, until they were little more than whispers. The entity, once towering and terrifying, was shrinking, its form unraveling like smoke caught in the wind. Its eyes, once burning with malice, dimmed and flickered before finally fading into the void. With a final, anguished roar, the entity vanished, consumed by the light. The park fell into silence once more, the shadows retreating, the fog lifting to reveal the empty, desolate landscape. Lucas stood alone, the toy car still glowing faintly in his hand. The battle was over. The entity was gone. But as he looked around the park, at the decaying rides and crumbling attractions, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. The park was empty now, silent and still. But deep down, Lucas knew that some things never really die. And somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard the faintest sound of a roller coaster beginning to move. The park was silent now, a hollow emptiness replacing the chaotic nightmare that had unfolded moments before. The fog had lifted, revealing the derelict remains of the amusement park under the pale, cold moonlight. Lucas stood alone, the small wooden car still clutched tightly in his hand, its faint glow having disappeared with the entity. His breath came in slow, heavy gasps as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. He had faced the darkness, confronted his past, and somehow survived. But despite the eerie calm that now blanketed the park, a sense of unease lingered in the air, a subtle whisper of something unfinished. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if the very earth was holding its breath. The shadows, though no longer writhing with malice, seemed to cling to the corners of the park, watching from the edges of his vision. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the entity, though defeated, hadn't truly left. It was as if the park itself was still alive, still feeding on the memories and fears of those who had once walked its paths. He looked around at the twisted metal structures, the broken-down rides, and the decaying remnants of a forgotten joy. Everything was still, but the silence wasn't comforting. It felt too deliberate, as if the park was waiting for something or someone. A chill ran down his spine as the wind picked up, rustling the leaves on the ground and carrying with it a faint, familiar sound. The distant echo of a roller coaster, the clinking of chains, and a soft, muffled scream. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the park for the source of the noise. The roller coaster, which had been still moments ago, now seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. The cars were empty, the tracks broken, yet the sound was unmistakable. The creaking of metal, the faint groan of wheels on rusted rails. It was as if the ride was alive again, moving in some spectral loop, reliving the horrors of the past. As Lucas stared at the ride, he felt a sharp pain in his wrist. The old scar, the one that had burned earlier, was throbbing again. He looked down and saw that the scar, faint but present for years, had split open slightly, a thin line of blood trickling from it. The sight filled him with dread, the wound a reminder that this place wasn't done with him yet. The park had left its mark on him long ago, and it wasn't going to let him go so easily. The wind shifted again, and with it came another sound, a faint, eerie melody. It was a lullaby, the same song his mother had sung to him as a child. The notes drifted through the air, carried on the wind like a ghost's whisper, haunting and familiar. But this time, the melody wasn't comforting. It was twisted off-key, as if something malevolent was playing it, mocking the innocence of his memories. Lucas turned in a slow circle, trying to locate the source of the music, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows at the edge of the park seemed to shift, just out of sight, as if something was moving through them. His breath quickened as the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. The entity was gone, but something else remained. Something deeper, older, and far more dangerous. The park wasn't just haunted by the entity. It was haunted by everything that had ever happened here. Every scream, every death, every lost soul had left an imprint, and those echoes were still here, lingering in the shadows, trapped in the rusted metal and decaying wood. The darkness that had consumed the park wasn't just one creature. It was the accumulation of years of pain and fear, feeding on itself, growing stronger with every victim it claimed. And though Lucas had faced the entity, he hadn't destroyed the park's hold on him. As he stood there, the lullaby still playing in the distance, a cold realization settled over him. This place was a trap, a prison for those who stumbled into its grasp. The entity had been just one piece of the puzzle. There was something far worse here, something that couldn't be fought or destroyed. The park was the darkness. It had always been here, waiting, feeding, and would continue long after Lucas had left. If he ever left. A low, ominous creak echoed from the direction of the Ferris wheel. Lucas turned slowly, his eyes wide with fear. The ride, which had been dormant, was moving again. The cabins, rusted and falling apart, were swaying in the wind, and as they turned, he could see shapes inside them, faint, shadowy figures sitting in the seats. They were watching him, their faces obscured by the dark, their presence palpable. His heart raced as the realization hit him. The park wasn't letting him go. It had already claimed him the moment he had stepped through the gates. The entity might be gone, but the park itself still held him, still wanted something from him. He had broken the cycle once, but it wasn't enough. The shadows, the whispers, the ghosts of the past, they would always be here, waiting for him to make a mistake, to fall back into their grasp. Lucas took a deep breath, his hands trembling. He needed to leave, to escape this place before it consumed him completely. But as he turned toward the exit, the ground shifted beneath him, the fog thickening once more. The wind howled, carrying with it the sounds of distant laughter, twisted and cruel. The park was alive, and it was hungry. With every step he took toward the gates, the air grew heavier, the shadows closing in around him. He could feel the presence of the lost souls, their cold hands reaching for him from the darkness, trying to pull him back. His mind raced, fear clawing at him, but he forced himself to keep moving, one step at a time. The exit was just ahead, a few feet away, but it felt like miles. As Lucas approached the gates, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just random voices anymore. They were calling his name. Lucas. The sound sent a chill down his spine, and he froze, his hand on the rusted gate. The air was thick with tension, the fog swirling violently around him. The voices, the shadows, the darkness. They were all waiting, watching, daring him to leave. For a moment, he hesitated. What if he couldn't escape? What if the park followed him, haunted him for the rest of his life? The thought gnawed at him, filling him with doubt. But then, from deep within the fog, the sound of the roller coaster's chains rattled one last time, and Lucas knew he couldn't stay. Without looking back, he pushed the gate open and stepped out into the night, the whispers fading behind him. The fog began to lift, the cold wind dying down. He had escaped, but as he walked away from the park, leaving the gates behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. And in the distance, just barely audible over the sound of his footsteps, Lucas heard the faint, unmistakable echo of children's laughter. The park had let him go. For now.